The night my promotion was announced on national television, my parents were 3 states away celebrating my brother's birthday at a lake house they rented for the whole week. I didn't cry when I found out they weren't coming. That part surprised everyone, including me, but I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Wren. I'm 31 years old, and I work as a structural engineer for a mid-sized infrastructure firm in Columbus, Ohio. I have one younger brother named Tyler, who is 26, works part-time at a sporting goods store, and has never in his life paid a single bill on time. I love him. I also know exactly what he is, and I know exactly what he is, and I know exactly what my parents are too. It just took me about 28 years to admit it to myself. Growing up, I did my own laundry by the time I was 9. Not because my mom was sick, not because we were in some crisis, just because she was busy with Tyler. Tyler had soccer practice on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Tyler needed new cleats. Tyler's science project was due, and she had to help him build it because he'd waited until Sunday night. I learned early that if I needed clean clothes for school, I should probably handle that myself. I'm not saying this to sound sad. I'm saying it because it matters later. By the time I was 12, I was packing my own lunch, scheduling my own dentist appointments. My mom would sign the permission slips, she wasn't completely absent, and figuring out the bus routes to get myself to my middle school's robotics club after school when she forgot to pick me up, which was most weeks. My dad worked long hours. When he was home, he was tired. He wasn't a bad man. He was just not really there, even when he was sitting in the same room. He watched Tyler's soccer games on weekends with a thermos of coffee and a lawn chair and something almost like joy on his face. I saw that look maybe twice in my life, directed at me. Once, when I was 14, I broke my wrist falling off my bike. I rode my bike to urgent care. It was a little under 2 miles. I kept my left hand tucked against my chest the whole way. The woman at the front desk looked at me like she was about to call someone, and I told her my mom was parking the car. She believed me. My mom came an hour and a half later. She'd been helping Tyler study for a history test. I don't tell that story to make people feel sorry for me. I tell it because it explains who I became. I became someone who figured things out. Someone who didn't wait to be rescued. Someone who, by the time she got a full scholarship to Ohio State for engineering, had already been functioning as her own parent for most of her adolescence. My parents came to my high school graduation. I remember being surprised. Tyler had a club tournament that weekend, but it was out of town and they decided not to drive him, since he could carpool with a teammate. So they came. My mom took pictures. My dad shook my hand and said he was proud of me. It felt genuine. I held on to that for a long time. College was different. I was good at it in a way that felt almost physical, like the work fit the shape of my brain exactly. I studied hard. I had a tight group of friends, and my closest friend was a woman named Becky, Rebecca, technically, but nobody called her that, whose family became something I hadn't expected, a second gravitational pull. Becky's parents, Jim and Carol, were the kind of people who showed up, not in a dramatic way, just consistently. They came to Parents' Weekend every year, all 4 years. They brought food. They remembered the names of my professors. When Becky mentioned I was stressed about my senior thesis, Carol called me directly to ask if I needed help finding any research resources through her university library access. I barely knew how to receive that kind of attention. I kept waiting for a catch. There wasn't one. They were just good people. Becky knew about my family situation without me ever having to explain it completely. She'd watched me deflect questions about my parents for 4 years. She'd seen me invent excuses at Parents' Weekend when they didn't come sophomore and junior year. She never pushed. She just quietly made space for me at her family's table, and I quietly accepted. After graduation, I got a job with my firm right out of college. Entry level, but it was real work. I was good at it. I moved up faster than most people in my cohort. By 28, I was leading my own project teams. By 30, I was being considered for the kind of position that gets talked about in company-wide emails. My family knew I worked in engineering. That's about the level of detail they retained. My mom once introduced me at a family Christmas as the one who builds bridges, kind of. My brother thought I worked on video game graphics because he'd misunderstood something I said 3 years earlier and no one had corrected him since. Tyler, in those same years, had moved back home twice, had a brief stint trying to flip furniture he bought at estate sales, and had spent about 8 months managing a friend's food truck before that ended badly. My parents bankrolled most of it. Not maliciously. They just couldn't say no to him, and saying yes to him meant there was less of everything. Time, money, energy, left over for anything else. I had stopped expecting any of it by then. I had my own savings account, my own apartment, my own life built from scratch with no assistance. What I hadn't stopped expecting completely was to be seen. That was the part I couldn't seem to let go of, no matter how many times I told myself I had. About 4 months ago, my firm was selected to partner on a federal infrastructure project, a major bridge rehabilitation project along the I-70 corridor. It was the kind of contract that gets written up in engineering trade publications. Our CEO, a man named Mr. Hensley, gathered the whole company for the announcement and named the leads. I was one of them. Senior project engineer, lead structural. It was the thing I'd been working toward for 9 years. He told us at the same meeting that the project kickoff would be covered by a regional news outlet and that there was a possibility of a segment on a national infrastructure funding news special, the kind of thing that airs on public broadcasting and cable news when the government wants to show where infrastructure dollars are going. It wasn't guaranteed. It might just be a 2-minute clip, but it might be more. I called my parents that night. My mom picked up and I told her. There was a pause and she said, "Oh, that's great, honey." Then she said, "Tyler's birthday is coming up. We're thinking of renting a lake house in Michigan. Do you think you might be able to come?" I asked if she'd heard what I said. She said yes, of course. It sounded like a really big deal. Then she asked about the lake house again. I said I'd think about it, because I didn't know yet what my schedule would look like with the project launch. 2 weeks later, she called to tell me they'd booked the lake house. The dates were the same week as the project kickoff event, which I had already told her about. I mentioned this. She said, "Oh, but it's just a work thing, right? Tyler only turns 26 once." As if anyone only turns any age once. As if that sentence made sense. I didn't argue. I said, "Okay, Mom." I sat with the phone in my hand for a while after we hung up. That was when I called Becky. She listened to the whole thing, the way she always does, without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Wren, my parents would be so proud of you. Can I tell them?" She asked this like it was a real question, like she wasn't sure if she had permission. I said yes. "Jim called me 2 days later," he said. "I know we're not your parents, but Carol and I would be honored to come, if that's an invitation." His voice was the same steady, warm thing it had always been. I told him it was absolutely an invitation. Carol got on the phone and said she was going to need to know exactly what to wear to an engineering project launch because she wanted to look appropriate and also, she said, impressive, because you deserve impressive. I laughed for the first time in what felt like weeks. The project kickoff event was held at a downtown Columbus event space. A nice one, not fancy, but clean and professional, with the firm's name on a banner and rows of chairs for guests and local stakeholders. There was a reception afterward with catered food. Local press was there. And yes, the crew from the public broadcasting news segment was there, with cameras and a reporter I recognized from a segment I'd seen twice on TV. Jim and Carol drove 4 hours from Pittsburgh. They arrived early. Carol had worn a navy blazer. Jim had on a tie. They looked like they were going to their own child's graduation, which I realize is exactly what this was, in the way that mattered. Before the program started, Mr. Hensley came over to meet them. I introduced them as family friends, Becky's parents, and he shook their hands and said something kind. Carol asked him 3 intelligent questions about the infrastructure project that she had clearly researched in advance. He was visibly impressed. Jim stood next to me and put his hand briefly on my shoulder and said, "You did good, kid." Just that. 4 words. I had to look at the ceiling for a second. When Mr. Hensley made the formal announcements. He talked about the significance of the I-70 project, the federal funding behind it, the years of planning. He introduced the project team one by one. When he said my name, he said more than just my name. He said I had been one of the most consistently excellent engineers this firm has seen in 15 years, that I had come up from entry level, that I represented exactly what the company valued. He said he was proud to have me leading this. The camera was rolling. I heard Carol make a sound from the audience. Not loud, just a sound, like something caught in her throat. I looked over and she was pressing her hand to her mouth. Jim's jaw was set tight and he was nodding slowly, the way men do when they're trying not to let their face do too much. There was applause. Real applause, not polite applause. The news segment ran 4 days later. I hadn't known what to expect in terms of how much they'd use. They used more than I expected. Almost 3 minutes specifically on our team's portion of the project, with my name on screen and a brief interview clip where I talked about what the structural rehabilitation would mean for freight and commuter traffic in the region. They showed the event. They showed me at the podium. They showed Jim and Carol in the audience. And because Carol had worn the navy blazer and Jim the tie, they looked like exactly what they were. Proud family. My phone buzzed while the segment was still airing. Then again. 22 missed calls from my mom by the time it was over. 14 texts, starting with "Is that you on TV?" and escalating from there. 6 calls from my dad, who never calls. 2 from Tyler, which I thought was interesting, since he'd never once called me in my adult life for anything other than to borrow money. I sat on my couch. The segment had ended. There was a different news story on now. Something about weather patterns in the Midwest. My apartment was quiet. Becky was there with me. She'd come over with wine and take out Ty because she said she wasn't going to let me watch this alone. She looked at my phone screen and then at me. "What do you want to do?" she asked. I put the phone face down on the coffee table. "Nothing," I said. "Not tonight." She nodded and refilled my glass, and we watched the rest of the news in comfortable silence. I didn't call them back that night. I didn't call them the next morning either. My mom sent a text that said, "We're so proud of you," with 3 exclamation points, which was a strange thing to receive from someone who hadn't asked a single follow-up question when I called her with the news 4 weeks earlier. My dad left a voicemail. He said my name and then said he'd seen me on TV, and his voice cracked slightly on the word TV, and he said to call him back when I had a chance. I listened to it twice. The crack in his voice was real. I believed it was real. I just didn't know what to do with something real arriving 4 weeks too late. Tyler sent a text that said, "Dude, you were on the news low. Congrats." I appreciated its honesty more than the rest of it. I called Jim and Carol first. Carol picked up on the second ring and said, "We've watched it 4 times. Her voice was full. I told her thank you, and she said, "Don't thank us, Wren. We were the lucky ones. You let us be there." And that undid something in me that I'd been holding very carefully together for a long time. I cried then. The first time I'd cried about any of this in years. Carol listened and didn't rush me and didn't say anything that made it about her. She just let me have it. When I finally called my parents back, it was 2 days after the segment aired. My mom answered and started talking immediately. How great it had looked. How everyone at the lake house had gathered around Tyler's girlfriend's laptop when my aunt texted them a link. How my cousin had shared it on Facebook. She said, "We're so proud." 4 more times in the first 90 seconds. I let her talk. When she ran out of steam, there was a pause, and I said, "Mom, you knew about the kickoff event." She said she knew, and that it had all worked out because we could watch it on TV. I said it hadn't worked out. I said that I'd been working towards something for 9 years, and that when the moment came, the people I'd hoped would be there weren't there, and that I'd had to look out at an audience and find someone else's parents to look at so that I could get through it without falling apart. She was quiet. I said I wasn't angry, and I meant it mostly. The anger had burned off somewhere around the second glass of wine watching the segment with Becky. What was left wasn't anger, it was just clarity, clean and a little cold. Like water. I told her that I loved her. I told her I would always love her. I told her that Tyler's birthday would come again next year, and the year after that, and that I hoped they had a wonderful time at the lake. Truly, I did. And I told her that the next time something mattered to me, really mattered, I was going to tell her, and I was going to see what she decided to do with that information. And that would tell me everything I needed to know about what to do next. She said, "What does that mean?" I said. "It means I love you, Mom. I'll talk to you soon." I hung up. The project is going well. We're 6 weeks in and we're slightly ahead of schedule, which in infrastructure work is not a small thing. Mr. Hensley mentioned last week that there has been a conversation about expanding my role on the next phase. Jim texts me occasionally with articles about engineering projects he thinks are interesting. Carol sent a care package to my office last month. Nice tea, a card, a small succulent in a pot that said, "Grow where you're planted," on the side. I've kept the succulent on my desk. It's doing fine. Becky and I had dinner 2 weekends ago. She said her parents talk about me like I'm family. She said it the way you say something you've said before, matter of fact, like it's just true. I didn't argue with her. I'm not the girl who rode her bike to urgent care with a broken wrist anymore. But I remember her clearly. I think about her sometimes. That 12-year-old figuring out bus routes and signing her own field trip forms and learning, very young, that if you want something done, you probably have to do it yourself. She turned out okay. Better than okay. She turned out to be someone worth showing up for. It just took the right people to prove it. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in a dramatic way, just quietly. The way you do when you're alone in your apartment and the news is on and your phone is face down on the coffee table and you're trying to make sense of how you got here. The thing about the way I was raised is that it taught me something my parents never intended to teach me. They thought they were just living their lives, prioritizing what felt urgent, doing what came naturally to them. What they were actually doing was showing me over and over again that I was the one person in the room who didn't need anything. And because I believed them, because I internalized that and made it true, I became someone who genuinely didn't need much. I learned to fix problems before they became crises. I learned to show up for myself because no one else was going to. I built a career and a life and a skill set entirely on the foundation of knowing that waiting around for rescue was not a strategy. That's the strange gift of being overlooked. It doesn't feel like a gift when you're 9 years old doing your own laundry. It doesn't feel like a gift when you're riding your bike to urgent care with a broken wrist, keeping your arm tucked against your chest so it doesn't hurt worse. But it builds something. It builds a person who is not fragile, who doesn't collapse when things don't go the way she hoped, who knows how to keep moving. What it doesn't build, and this is the part I had to learn on my own much later, is the ability to let people in. That part I had to figure out deliberately. Jim and Carol didn't just show up at my promotion event. They showed up every time Becky mentioned my name over the span of years. They paid attention when I wasn't even in the room. That kind of consistency from other people, I didn't know how to receive it at first. I kept waiting for it to cost me something. It didn't. Some people are just like that. And I think the reason I found them, the reason Becky became my closest friend and her family became mine, is that I was also like that. I showed up for Becky. I remembered things that mattered to her. I paid attention. You get back, eventually, what you put into the world. Not always from the people you hoped. Not always on the timeline you expected. But it comes back. That's not a spiritual claim. It's just pattern recognition from living long enough to see it play out. My parents are not villains. I want to be clear about that. Because the easiest version of this story makes them into something they're not. They love Tyler. They love me, in whatever way they know how. The problem was never love. It was attention, and attention is a choice you make every single day, in small ways, sometimes without even realizing it. They chose, consistently, where to put theirs, and I made a choice too, eventually. Not to punish them for it, not to cut them off, but to stop measuring my worth by whether or not they showed up. Wren at 12, riding that bike with one arm, figured out something important. you can get where you're going even when no one comes for you. The goal is to eventually build a life where you're not riding alone anymore. Not because you need someone to carry you, but because you become someone worth riding alongside. That's what Jim and Carol taught me, without ever saying it directly. And that's what I'm still learning to accept.